Velkommen til DMN og Ensums webinar. Jeg har denne gang glæden af at have Deborah Ball på besøg i vores webinar. Deborah er professor fra Universitetet i Michigan og har arbejdet med læring og undervisning i matematik i mange år, og er velkendt for sin store forskning. Hun er blandt andet meget optaget af, hvordan arbejder vi med en praksis i klasselokalet, så vi bedst tænkeligt får eleverne ind i en positiv læringssituation. Og det er noget af det, vi skal høre lidt om i dag. Det bliver, som vi plejer, hvis I har set et webinar tidligere. Deborah vil starte med at vise sine slides og fortælle om sin forskning. Og efterfølgende, det er cirka 25-30 minutter, så vil vi lave en kort pause, og så vil jeg stille nogle spørgsmål til Deborah efterfølgende. Okay, Deborah, I just told the audience how a great person you are, and important for the mathematical didactic environment. So after this introduction, I would like you to make your presentation.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. What I'm going to talk about, I've titled Supporting Learners to Flourish Mathematically, and I'm going to explain right away what I mean by that. Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. It has 3 parts. Then the first part, I'm going to explain what this idea of mathematical flourishing means and why it is important. Then the second part of what I'm going to present, I'm going to talk more generally about how teaching practice is so crucial for supporting learners to flourish in this way. And then the third part, I'm going to introduce a practice that I call acknowledging competence, and I'm going to explain why it's powerful for helping young people flourish mathematically. So first, what do I mean when I say flourish mathematically, and why is this so important? It has several parts. So this phrase, first of all, includes what you might expect, that students should learn concepts in mathematics, they should develop procedural skill and fluency, they should be able to think mathematically and reason, make arguments, use representations, all the things that we might typically think of as mathematical competence. But that's not all there is to flourishing. It also includes developing a positive mathematical identity. And by that I mean that children should develop a sense that they're good at math, that math is something interesting that they'd like to do. It doesn't necessarily mean that they pursue a career in mathematics, but like other things that we learn in school, they would see this as an interesting domain. There's also one more component to this concept of mathematical flourishing, and this is more at the societal level. Here I mean that we want, I think, to develop an entire society or a country in which most people see themselves as mathematically capable, that they are interested in math, and that we change the fact that in many countries in the world, many adults don't see themselves as good at math at all. So it's also a larger collective goal. The second thing I want to talk about is, how does teaching practice associated with this? How can teaching practice develop mathematical flourishing? So here I have on this slide some images of children in math classes. You can see some children sitting on a rug, talking with their teacher. You see some children working independently on problems. You also see a girl with her head down on a stack of books. And that's meant to represent that there's some things that tend to be patterns in mathematical classrooms. One is that math is often treated as an individual activity. You do math on your own. You don't compare with other people. Sometimes that's even considered to be cheating. Often young people learn that being good at math is mostly about getting the right answer and getting it quickly. I think students also learn through their mathematics education that some people are just good at math and other people are not. And they also often learn that during math class, it's important to sit still and pay attention and listen. All of these things are kind of normal, but what I'm saying here is that often that normal kind of work in classrooms doesn't help students to flourish mathematically. So it's useful to think about, even when we think we're teaching mathematics well, it often doesn't contribute to flourishing. Norms that are typical in math classrooms are invisible precisely because they are normal. We're kind of used to the idea that children would work on math independently, and the kinds of harms that this creates often aren't noticed. So teaching is powerful, and being deliberate about what you do can make significant changes in who flourishes. So thinking about how to be deliberate is what I want to focus on now. And I want to turn now to the practice I call acknowledging competence and talk about what it is and what makes it so powerful. Now, to support students' mathematical flourishing, often teachers praise students, which of course is a good thing to do. They might say things like, "Good job," or "You're working really well today," or "Nice work," or "I'm proud of you," and other things that are on this slide. "You're working like a good mathematician." And these are good things to say, but I'm going to try to show that that's incomplete. And if we're trying to help students flourish mathematically, there's something a little bit different that's important to be doing. Praise can be useful, but acknowledging competence, which is what we're going to talk about next, is very helpful and is different from that. This idea of acknowledging competence draws on a theory that is called positioning theory. It uses a lot of big words that are maybe not so easy to understand, but it's in some ways a very simple idea. The idea is that in the ways that we interact with one another, even in everyday life, we signal to people how we regard them. We might treat people in a way that makes them feel smart or interesting, or we might sort of not pay attention to somebody and make them feel like they're not that interesting or not that smart. People also position themselves. Someone who doesn't think that they're good at math might be very quiet in a math class or not contribute to the discussion. So positioning is something about the social interactions and the moves we make with language and the way we look at people that position people to be in different kinds of relationships with each other and with themselves. It's a theory from social psychology by Bronwyn Davies and Rome Harre, and it's an interesting theory that helps to contribute to this practice of acknowledging competence. So what is acknowledging competence? Basically, it's using the power that we have as teachers to do three things. The first thing is that we have the power to broaden for young people what it even means to be good at mathematics, what mathematics includes, what it means to be smart, and what math even is about. And that's something we have the capability to do as teachers. So you can think of this part as really about teaching math and teaching students what math is. But the second thing is that it's a practice that enables the teacher to intervene to change the way students are positioned relative to each other. So for example, if there's a student in the class who tends to be very quiet and not contribute to class, thinks of himself as not good at math, or perhaps other students assume he's not good at math, the teacher can do things that cause the student to realize, oh, and maybe I am pretty good at math, or other students to see that student as capable. In addition to how it can work in the classroom, it's also an individual practice, because the ways that teachers acknowledge competence could happen in one-to-one conversations between the teacher and the student, in the kinds of conversations, the kinds of comments the teacher makes to the student. So it can support positive individual identities and self-positioning. So what does it require to be able to do this practice? First of all, if you're going to broaden what mathematics means in your classroom, you have to keep developing your own ideas about what mathematics even means, what it includes. So for example, if you have learned that mathematics is really important to do fast and to get the right answer, you may have to learn more ideas about what being good at math is. For example, being good at math includes being able to explain something very clearly. It might include being able to analyze a solution that didn't quite work well. It might include asking a really good mathematical question. All of those things are part of being good at math and part of what math includes, but sometimes we don't convey that to students. A second thing that you have to be able to do to be able to acknowledge competence is that you have to use this idea of positioning that I spoke about to intervene and to influence how students are seen and how they see themselves. The hardest part about all of this is that these moves that you make as a teacher, you have to use them really strategically. Because if you say something about a student that the student doesn't value, it may work against you. For example, if a teacher were to say to a student, "You just really gave a great explanation in class," but if the student doesn't feel good about the teacher saying that to her, perhaps when they're later in the day, they're eating lunch or something, maybe other students make fun of the student or say something mean. So you have to get a sense of, with the age students you work with and the context, what kinds of statements by the teacher would be seen as good and valuable. That's a hard thing to figure out, and it's really dependent on your own context. So I'm going to show a video now where we're going to try to practice and observe what acknowledging competence looks like. First, I'll explain what the mathematics problem is that the children are working on. This is a group of children who are 10 years old. The problem they're working on is this one. You see two images here, and the question that they're working on is, what fraction of each rectangle is shaded gray? I think if you look at the drawings, you can see there's something very deliberate about the task, because both drawings have a gray square, it's shaded gray, and both squares are the same size and shape. So both drawings also have 3 parts. The one on the left has 3 parts with 1 shaded gray. The one on the right also has 3 parts, 1 shaded gray. But the important idea here is that when you use an area to look at a fraction, the various areas or parts have to be equal. And the one on the left has equal parts, the one on the right does not. So the purpose of the task is to engage the students in coming to understand that it's crucial that the parts be equal. And some students will think that the one on the right is 1/3 also, and this is designed to precipitate a good discussion among the students to where they come to the conclusion that it's important for the parts to be equal. So we're going to be looking at a video of students discussing this task. And the viewing focus that I would like you to take is to see if you can notice particular kinds of mathematical competence in the children who are participating. You might try to watch whose competences are acknowledged by the teacher or by other students, and how is that done? It might come from things students say, it might come things the teacher says. You could also see if there are any missed opportunities where someone does something competent and neither the teacher nor other students says anything about it. There are 6 children that are going to be speaking. It's a whole class, but in this short video, these 6 children will be the ones doing things that you'll notice. So the names of the children are Antar, Gabrielle, Gabby, Vershawn, Marquise, and Cassie. So as I said, they're all 10 years old, and they're in a program in which they're working on mathematics together. So I'm going to play the video now, and this is the focus that I would like you to take while you watch the video.
Who'd like to answer what you think about the second rectangle? We're only going to be able to talk about this briefly. We probably won't finish it. Who'd like to explain what you think? Antar, what do you think? Could you come up to the board and explain? Thank you. I really like the way the people who are coming to the board are doing today. You're explaining really well. Here's a marker. Can you explain your thinking?
I think it's not a fraction because all of the parts are not equally the same shape.
Can you say that one more time to the class?
I think it's not a fraction because all the parts are not equally the same.
Can someone repeat what Antar said? Very nice, Antar. What did he say? Gabriella?
He said that he doesn't think it's a fraction because not all the parts are equal.
Is that what you said? Okay, would someone like to comment on that, agree or disagree with him? Okay, let's see. How about Gabby?
I disagree.
What do you think?
I think the fraction is 1/4.
1/4? Do you want to come up and say why you think it's 1/4? Antar, do you want to stay there? Do you want to sit down? Okay, thank you very much. You did a good job of explaining your thinking. So let's hear what Gabby's thinking.
I think it's 1/4 because, like he said, all the fractions aren't the same, but you can make them the same by dividing a line down the middle.
Can you go ahead and want to show us here? Here's something you can use for that. Wait 1 second. Instead of drawing it, why don't you just use this? That way if someone wants to take it off again, they can. Okay, so now explain what you've done. Talk to the class, okay?
I divided it down the middle because since it's not equal, you have to make it equal.
And so then you decided,
It's 1/4.
okay, can someone repeat what Gabby said, what she did and what she said? This actually goes very nicely with what you said, Antar, because Antar noticed that the parts weren't equal, and what Gabby is doing has to do with equal parts. So these two answers go together very nicely. Can someone repeat what she said? How about Vershawn? What did she say? You didn't know? Do you want her to say it one more time and will you follow it? Okay, say it one more time.
You have to make the fraction the same since it's not equal, and you have to divide it by a part where it's going to be equal.
Now can you explain what she said? Do you want someone else to try? Okay, but follow, okay? Because I want you to be able to follow when other people explain, all right? So who would like to explain what she just said? How about Marquise? Can you do it? What did Gabby say? Can you stand where he can see? He can't probably see so well. What did she do to the second problem?
She added a line to make it. She added a line to make it 2 more.
To make it what?
To make it like this whole piece, 2 more pieces.
Uh-huh.
So I can actually.
And why did she do that? Can you say why did you add the line?
Equal.
Can you say that again, Marquise? Why did she add the line?
So I can make 4.
What word did Gabby just say that you need to say? She said she didn't just make 4 parts, she made what kind of parts? Say it again. Equal parts. The same size. Do you see that, Marquise?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and she came up with 1/4. Cassie?
Well, I just wanted to say I disagree.
You disagree with her? Okay.
I disagree because the question was asking what fraction of the rectangle is shaded gray already before you add the line, and my answer for it was 1 1/2.
Uh-huh.
Because you might say it's 3 1/3, but he's right, it's not equal. So
That was Antar. Antar's right?
Antar said it's not equal. So but there's 1/2 below, like a full rectangle.
Here, we can take the line back off for a minute. Gabby, I think you can sit down. I think you did a nice job of explaining. I can take this line back off. So what are you saying now?
There's the part that is shaded would have to be 1/2 because below there is it's cut up into a half.
This
of
right
the
here?
one above it. So that's how I got my answer 1 1/2.
Okay, we're going to stop right now. We're not going to talk more about what Cassie just said, but we heard an answer from Antar. He said they're not equal, so it's not a fraction. Then Gabby made them equal and said it's 1/4. And now Cassie has another answer. She says 1 1/2. So we will talk about that tomorrow, and we're not going to finish that right now.
So let's spend a moment distinguishing acknowledging competence from praise. So as I said earlier, praise could include things like saying good job, or you're working really well today, or I'm really proud of you. And each of the children who spoke, the teacher might have said those things. Praise is basically verbal feedback with the purpose of evaluating what a student did. But acknowledging competence is more intentional. It's naming very specific mathematical skills or competences and highlighting specific aspects of mathematics that a student is doing. And this is why it both assigns to the student a level of competence and points out how the student is doing something competent, but also communicates to everyone what being good at math or doing math well includes. So an example of kinds of statements one might make when acknowledging competence would be, it was particularly clear how you used your drawing to explain your thinking. Or you might say something like, Balin gave a clear and specific mathematical explanation. Or a teacher might say, one thing that was really important about what Lacan said was to use the definition we developed. So these are just general examples that I wanted to make sure were clear about the difference between saying something positive to students in the form of praise, which can be useful, and deliberately and intentionally positioning students as competent and broadening what students see as included in mathematical competence. So in order to prepare to acknowledge competence, you might have to think about what kinds of competence you're hoping to notice during class. You might think of things like explaining one's reasoning. We saw a lot of that on the video. Presenting one's ideas to others is another part of mathematical competence, and again, we saw that multiple times on the video. Showing a different solution approach or method, asking a good question, using a representation skillfully, or making connections among ideas. And we saw all of those things students were doing on that video. So the question is, how does a teacher notice those things, and what can the teacher do by helping students learn that that's part of mathematical competence, but also being very deliberate about who the teacher lifts up and positions as having done something that was important mathematically. So if all you do is point out mathematical competence, but you point out the same students who are already thinking that they're good at math or already seen by their classmates as good at math, you're not yet fully doing the practice. So it combines broadening mathematical competence and what students think it includes, and changing and interrupting patterns that may exist in your class about who is seen as competent typically. So it's a disruptive practice. It can disrupt narrow views of mathematics that are often what students take away from their classroom experiences. It can disrupt who gets seen as mathematical competence. For example, often it has been the case that boys are seen as more mathematically competent than girls. We know that that's not true, but it can happen often that that's what students begin to understand from their experiences in school by who talks more, who volunteers more often, who gets noticed by the teacher. And in different countries, there may be also members of particular groups, such as immigrant children or children who don't speak the language, who may be often not seen as competent. And the teacher would have to be thinking carefully about how to make sure that all of the students at different times are seen as competent. This disrupts a pattern that would happen if the teacher didn't pay attention to this. It's also a way of disrupting negative views that students have of themselves. If a student doesn't think that they're good at math, but the teacher goes out of her way to point out something that that student did that was extremely competent, the student begins to realize, I may think I'm not good at math, but my teacher just pointed out something that I didn't. I didn't even realize that that was an important thing to do. So what's involved in being able to do this practice? First of all, as I've said, one has to be able to recognize and broaden what comprises mathematics as a subject and what mathematical competence includes, and be able to see that in your students. The other thing that's important is understand in your own country or society, what are the broader factors that influence who is seen as competent. In the United States, for example, there are many patterns that have to do with racism and sexism, privileging of English language speakers, children of different classes, and this will be different in different countries. But there are broader factors besides your own classroom about who typically gets seen as competent. And based on these two considerations, you have to be able to intervene explicitly in the course of a lesson to acknowledge particular students' competence. So there are a couple of ways you could learn to do this. One way is for you as the teacher to name a specific competence that a particular student displayed in something that they said or did, and why that's so important in doing math. You can also ask the other students, what did that person just do that's so important to being good at math? And you can invite them to comment as well. And remember that what this includes is both attending to what counts as being good at math and who is seen as good at math. So let's think about Antar, Gabrielle, Gabby, Vershawn, Marquise, and Cassie. Think about whose competences would you acknowledge here? Whom would you choose to acknowledge and why? What would you actually say? So if we had more time, or if you go back and watch the video again, you could practice thinking, which students would you try to acknowledge? You can notice what the teacher did and also what other students did. I'm going to give a few examples now, but I would encourage you to consider watching the video one more time and practicing what it might look like to do this and observing what the teacher did or perhaps missed doing that is important to acknowledging competence. So here are some examples from this episode that we watched. The teacher could say to Antar, Antar contributed something very important. He pointed out that the parts are not equal. Could someone say why that's such an important thing that he said? I want you to notice that this is a very important move for the teacher because when Antar says it's not a fraction, it's quite possible that many teachers would hear that as a wrong answer because of course it can be a fraction. But he's saying something more important. He's saying because all the parts are not equally the same shape. So a teacher who does this is lifting up and pointing out his very important observation that second figure wasn't divided equally. And the teacher is choosing to pay attention to that part of what he said and not the part where he said it's not a fraction. Gabriella is the girl who repeated what Antar said. The teacher could say, Gabriella, you were listening so closely to Antar's explanation. That's really important for learning and developing ideas in math. Too often we don't think of listening to other children as a goal, or even of thinking of it as a competence in mathematics. But if students are going to be learning from one another in a class, that is a very important mathematical skill, to listen to someone's idea that's not your own idea and try to see what they're saying. Gabby is the one who said she disagreed and thought it was 1/4. So the teacher could say to Gabby, Gabby, you built on what Antar said. You showed a way to make the parts equal and name the fraction. So again, she's lifting up two things that Gabby did. Gabby used Antar's idea. That's an important mathematical skill. And she tried to show how what he objected to, that the parts weren't equal, how you could make them equal. Vershawn is the student who was not able to repeat what Gabby said. And you might see him as just failing. Perhaps he thinks of himself as not particularly good. You might know things about him. But a teacher could say, Vershawn, you were willing to say that you weren't ready to say what Gabby said. And that's an important part of learning to pay attention to your own thinking. You don't have to feel like you have something to say when you're not ready. So understanding where you are is an important part of being smart. Marquise is the one that the teacher keeps asking to say the word equal. But if you noticed, this was a missed opportunity because Marquise is holding up his notebook where he has taken notes on what Gabby said, which is remarkable for a 10-year-old. The teacher had not instructed them to do that. And the teacher might have said, instead of getting him to say the word equal over and over, the teacher might have said, you were keeping notes on what other people said. Keeping records is very helpful for learning in mathematics. You want to hold up your notebook and show everybody what you wrote down? And that would be an example of helping everyone see that that's an important learning practice or study practice, and Marquise was the one who did that. And finally, Cassie, who at the very end objects and has a very different answer. In many classes, Cassie might be seen as confused, not understanding. A teacher might just say, remember that you have to look at this whole, the whole rectangle. But Cassie, of course, is looking at a different whole. She's looking at the half of the whole, and that's completely legitimate mathematically. And so the teacher might say, you're looking at that in a different way, and that's interesting, and tomorrow you could explain more about your thinking. Tomorrow we can look at your thinking again, and we can think how it's connected to the ideas of naming a fraction. So there are some habits that as teachers we have to break in order to be good at this practice of acknowledging competence. One habit is that we often orient everything toward ourselves. So you might say something like, often to become good at acknowledging competence, there's some habits we have to break as teachers. So for example, often we find ourselves orienting everything toward ourselves. We might find ourselves saying things like, thank you for pointing that out. You helped me to see your thinking. But that's not actually positioning the student. That's orienting everything toward yourself. Another thing that might be done is this teacher might thank the student. Thank you for sharing your idea, instead of highlighting the mathematical value. Teachers sometimes find themselves correcting what the student said at the same time that they're acknowledging competence. So Cassie might say, thank you for coming up with a different idea, but remember that this is the whole we're talking about. And of course, saying good job instead of talking specifically about the mathematics. One thing one has to think about to become good at this is to think what will be valued in your own classroom, in your own context, what your students will feel lifted up by and highlighted by what you say to them. And that's not something I can tell you in advance fully, but I hope that these ideas give you some ways of thinking about how you might move to do less praise, not that it's not important, and do more of this acknowledging competence. Because acknowledging competence is a powerful teaching practice for enabling students to flourish mathematically.
Thank you very much, Deborah. We will now have a short break, and I think Deborah wants some more hot coffee for her throat. We'll be back in 1 or 2 minutes. Velkommen tilbage fra pausen. Deborah, you talk about Flourish math, and you talk about positive identity. It's well known that a lot of children in math are very demotivated about math, and some of them got math and anxiety. Shouldn't be special treatment about these children to get them into a positive identity?
Yes, I think it's true that many students learn in school that math is scary or they're not good at it. And I think that we can do a lot by changing what their experience is in school. So for example, today we were talking about what a teacher can do to name what it is to be good at math and help students realize that they actually are doing math well. I think they learn in school that what it means to do math is something that they aren't doing, like getting an answer very fast or getting the right answer. Not that, of course, does matter, but it's not at all the only thing. So I've had students who asked extremely good mathematical questions, and I found that when I could say, Bent, that was such an important question because you pointed exactly to the thing that we wanted to understand. Did everybody see how Bent asked a good question? And if you keep doing that kind of thing, students do change the way they're seeing themselves. And it's not something you're doing that's extraneous to mathematics. You're actually helping everyone in the class know not only is Bent doing something important, but that is an important part of mathematics. So what I like about this practice is it can intervene on anxiety by changing how students see themselves, but also how they see what math is. We give students a very narrow perception of mathematics in school often. And so it's not surprising that they aren't interested in it.
Don't you think that the subject math has more problems getting math anxiety? If you look at another subject, geography and art, it's not the same problem.
No, it's not. But I'm not sure what happens in Denmark, but in the United States, we have adults who feel that way about mathematics, and often their parents. So they say things to their children like, I was never good at math, don't worry. So students are getting this message everywhere. No one walks around saying, I never could read, or I never could be doing art or draw.
But maybe it's also more acceptable. It's all right not to use math. It's all right, I haven't positive identity, so why don't disturb me in that opinion?
Yeah, I think many people just decide it's not something I'm good at, it's not something I'm interested in, and I'm just going to do other things. But that has big costs for the individual because it is an important domain of human activity and knowledge and puzzle solving. But also as a society then we lack people who have these kinds of skills and knowledge, which is a problem.
You talk about the teachers' relations to the children, the way they behave around the children, but isn't there something about the collaboration between the pupils themselves who could be a part of making positive identity?
Yes, absolutely. That's a very important point. So I think what I was talking about is often we treat mathematics like it's very independent, individual, but having students work together, come up with solutions together, maybe present to the class together, they then support one another to become seeing themselves as capable. I think that is important. So I think we have to move away from the idea that each person has to work independently on math. Of course, sometimes, but we do more of that in that subject than most subjects.
I think I often hear children talk about they are nervous to make failure. But if you are among friends in the classroom, maybe they're more confident about making failure to each other.
Yes.
And use it in the classroom.
Yes, and as a teacher, you can also change the way you think about error or mistakes, because many mistakes are actually very useful. So when Antar said it's not a fraction, in some ways that was slightly a mistake because you can name the fraction, but I think we saw in the video that his comment helped everybody to learn after that. And several people mentioned him. They said, oh, it's like what Antar said. So that way, his experience that day wasn't, oh, I was at the board and I made a mistake. His experience was, I said something and my peers built on it.
But how do you convince children that to make failure is a part of our learning?
I think you have to make comments about that directly in class. Sometimes what I do is I will ask when we're having a math discussion, who has a solution that they think is wrong, they think isn't working, and would be willing to come to the board and show us how your answer is not working out and why you think it's not working. And then you're saying, and analyzing error in mathematics is an important thing to do, and you're contributing by showing us something that didn't work. But too often we only ask children to contribute who have the solution. There's no reason to do that. Mathematicians fail all the time when they try to make proofs. Why we insist that children are supposed to always have the right answer isn't what mathematics is at all. So back to your other question, I think the way we represent mathematics in school is so different from what people do who do mathematics in their everyday life or in professionally. But when we think about reading and writing in school, it's closer to what people who read and write in their life do. We've got this version of school mathematics that's distorted.
But why have this normal practice? And as I wrote to you, if I discuss this with teachers around in Denmark, they know about it. They're not very surprised that the normal practice maybe could be better learning and understanding math, but they are still doing it.
Well, it's an intergenerational problem because all of us who teach were also children in school earlier, and we experienced math being taught that way. That's how we learned it. So when I say in this talk, one has to have a broader understanding of mathematics, that's very challenging because most people who were teachers had that same narrow view of math when they were in school. So we're really asking teachers to know more math, more broadly and more flexibly than the average adult. And I don't think that everyone understands that that's a real challenge. Teachers can all read. They can all write. We're not asking them to do something they don't already do, but we're asking teachers to do something that they didn't experience in math.
But how do we change it? I'm a part of a teacher training. Is education, have it failed because they only do what they've learned from their own when they was children themselves, or pupils and the students? Could we make some in-service training about it? Could we make some collaboration at the school where we discuss what to do and so on? That's a way of handling it.
Yes, I think that you're right about that, and I think what I've noticed is that often either people who are becoming teachers or experienced teachers think that they're not good at math. I'm not good at math. So I think they have to see this as a large system in which all of us have that experience. So our job as teachers is to interrupt that. And that when teachers have more experience about what doing math can mean, they become more enthusiastic about trying to do that with their students. But I think the starting point has to be to realize what we all had and realize that it was limited and it's not about us. My students who are choosing to learn to be teachers often think they're not good at math. And I try to help them learn like everyone feels like that. But your job as a teacher is going to be to help change that. And they can learn that. They can unlearn what they think being good at math is and unlearn how they see themselves. It's a little bit like what I just talked about. They have to learn that they're competent, and they have to learn that mathematics is more than what they thought it was.
Sometimes I also think that it's complicated to see by yourself. Sometimes it's profitable to have a colleague in the classroom to have a discussion afterwards.
Right.
Because you can't see it yourself.
No, I think that's right, and I think that means understanding our teaching practice as a professional practice as opposed to being something about yourself. So if you come visit my class and you ask a question or you point something out, perhaps that I could have done better, I need to understand that you and I are talking together about practice like professionals, and we're trying to think how to do it better. I have to learn not to think you're criticizing me as a person.
Yeah, that's right.
It would be a little bit like a writer. If I give you a draft of a book I'm writing, I have to understand that when you offer criticism of the book, it's about the writing in the book. It's not about me. But I think that teaching is so personal that it takes some learning to feel open to having someone come to your class. So I think you have to create an environment where people understand that they're working together on improving practice. And I think I have seen that happen through professional development.
We have trying different way of handle the situation as you talk about. In Denmark, we have used lesson studies and other kind of. Is that a way to go to have this collaborative discussion in the belonging to teachers?
Yes, I think very much so, because I think it moves in the direction of what I was explaining to you, is coming to see the work of teaching as collective. So, for example, we have a summer program in which children come to learn math, but educators from all around the country, actually from other places in the world, come and watch the class.
Okay.
And then we discuss what happened in class that day, what did the teacher do. But it's not criticizing the teacher. It's like noticing things together. And we've found that moves teaching from being a private, hidden practice to being something more public. In the same way, surgeons have what's called a surgical theater, where when they're performing surgery, other surgeon or students sit in a balcony and watch. That's the same thing I'm talking about. You can have the same thing for teaching, where it's like lesson study. It's another variation where together you're looking at practice. But I think you're very right what you're saying.
But maybe it should be a better part of the teacher's education.
Yes, very much so.
To understand that the collaborative part of is a very important part of your teacher's job. Yeah, okay. What about the parents? You told us a little bit, but their attitude about to make real math education could be a problem for the teacher, because if he changes his way of doing it, maybe the parents think he's a bad mathematician.
Yeah, I think there are two things that can happen, and one is a good thing and one is not a good thing. One is that the bad thing is sometimes we don't explain to families why what we're trying to do in mathematics, why we're doing it, and also to understand the mathematics, because often parents in our country at least will say, this is so confusing what you're doing with my child. That's not how I learned it.
That's right.
Why don't you teach it the way I learned it? But a good thing that can happen when parents do understand is that they say things like, if I had had a teacher who helped me understand math this way, I would be better off. So I think it's about communication. I think we're asking a lot of teachers where we're asking them to change what they do and also communicate that to other adults. I think that's hard. And I don't think we do as much with that as we should. There should be programs for parents to help them see like why math needs to change. And it has to be really well done.
We have several schools around in Denmark where they make family math. In the afternoon, where we can come and play math with their children and so on. It's a way of doing it.
Yeah, that's very good. And one thing we've sometimes done when we do things like that is ask parents to identify things that they do in their home that are mathematical. And it turns out that that's very enlightening for parents, because they realize when I was adjusting a recipe the other day, I had my child work on that with me. They don't often even recognize that they're doing things that are mathematical. If you do something like pack things into your car for a trip, and you have a finite space, how you arrange the different objects in the trunk is geometric.
Yeah, that's right.
So parents are doing a lot of things, but helping them see you actually are doing math at home is very helpful.
Another part of the parents I would like to ask you is the tradition for argue. I think there are parents who don't use argue, but demand what to do or not to do and what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah.
So for some children, it's very confusing to make argue.
Yeah, the word argue is something that, for some groups of people, is not what you want your child to do.
No.
So we might have to adjust our language also. That perhaps what you're doing in mathematics is explaining or showing why something is true or making a critique. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think it can be very disrespectful when we don't realize that for some cultures, argument is not okay.
I think there are cultural differences in this
Absolutely.
using argue. I have learned. Another thing, you discuss the teacher's behavior in her questions. We saw the video, and the using of the word "why." If I look around in classrooms in Denmark, it's not very often I hear the word "why" be used. It's many times right and wrong questions.
I learned something interesting in my own teaching. I was learning to use the word "why" more often, but I noticed, or perhaps a colleague was observing me and noticed, to your point about collaborating, that I only said, if a student had something correct, I would say, how did you know that? But if they had something wrong, I would say, why did you think that? And I was giving the students, without my realizing it, I was giving a clue that answer is right.
You introduced
the word
somehow.
"no" would signal that it was correct. The word "think" made it sound not. So I had to learn to ask the same question every time. Also, at the beginning, because students don't get asked why very often, at the beginning of the school year, I find that my students think they're wrong if I ask why, because they're used to not being asked that. So I have to deliberately ask questions about correct answers so they get used to thinking that that's what we do. So students also have to unlearn that being asked why doesn't mean you're wrong. But I think that you're absolutely right, that this is something everyone has to learn to do differently.
And I think it takes years in the teaching to get all children comfortable about that's a part of the math education. So it's from the first grade you have to use it.
Yep.
You talk about interfere about the position in the classroom. That's hard stuff, I think. How much are you going to interfere, and how do you know about the positions? Because you can't be there in all time. You are in the classroom, but everything are going on in the pauses and how far do we go in this?
That's such a great question, Ben. I would just point out something that might be about English language and Danish language.
Okay.
So you use the word interfere, and I use the word intervene. I don't know if those are two different words in Danish, but
maybe I don't know.
It's very interesting because I think what you're worried about a little bit is interfering.
Yeah, that's right.
But I was thinking
about
so intervening is kind of getting into the middle of something.
I know.
So that's one point that you're pointing out. Like, do we have the right to do that?
Yeah, that's right.
And also, should we be doing that? But the other is, how do we know what the hierarchies are in our classrooms? And I think that's an extremely important question. So one way we know is that we can see that, when a particular student raises his hand, no one thinks that student is going to say anything correct. We see that in class. We can see that some students are always thought to be smart. If that student gives an answer, it must be right. We can see that. But there are also larger patterns. So in our context, which is you'd have to think what's true in Denmark, we know that, for example, girls who are African American, so they're girls and they're African American, are often seen as misbehaving or struggling, even when they're not. And so part of the goal is to be very deliberate about not letting that pattern come into your classroom. Yeah. So you would especially think about how children with certain identities might be positioned differently. And that is something that isn't about what you see outside of class. It's just something you know happens. But you're right, things could happen elsewhere that we don't know about. Yeah. So it is important to be sensitive. That's why I said you have to think about what you say, because you could say something that actually makes things worse. If I say, Bent said something really smart today, on the playground somebody might say to Bent, oh, ha, 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 you were smart today, the teacher likes you. That's not helpful. No. So you have to think what would be valued by those students and have people sort of take another look. Oh, I didn't realize that Bent said something important today. So you have to really think about how you do this and be careful not to make things worse. So I think your question is absolutely important.
I have read and also visit schools out of Denmark, and if I look in especially the English school system and I look in the Danish school system, there are differences between the relationship between the teacher and the pupil. I think the relationship between the pupils in the English schools I have visited is more distant. There are more distance between the teacher and the child than in Denmark. I think we have, and I have. When a Danish teacher writes and talk about his children, it's in a family way. They use words from family environment, and if you see writing and talking for an English teacher, his other words, it's more demanding, more military in somehow the way. So I think we in Denmark have a good tradition about the relation between the teacher and child, but sometimes it takes overhand. Can man see? It gets too much for the teacher because he can't handle everything. Yeah. So it's the limit between to be involved too much is also a question.
Yeah, I think that's important, and I think in teacher training and professional development, we need to understand that teaching is work about helping human beings develop. And so your relationship with the students really does matter. And we see cultural differences also in what the expectations are. But I think that's very interesting that you see that in Denmark, and that sounds like that's a strength of Danish teaching.
I think it's some of what we talk about in the Nordic country, I would say, the culture and Nordic culture. There's the differences. And we also have awareness about using results from research studies in USA, because some of the relationships in Denmark are different. So we have to translate it into our own culture.
Yep.
Yes.
I agree.
You're talking about breaking habits. Could you please give some more words about it? I think it's very important.
Yes, I think what teaching is so demanding and so complex that, of course, we have routines and habits that we use all the time. But some of those habits aren't good. And so we've learned them because we went to school, we saw our teachers doing them. So this word good job, I don't know if Danish teachers say that, but American teachers say that a lot. So I have to help people think, why is good job? Sounds nice. Why is that not a good habit? It's not a good habit because you're not helping the person know what they did that was good. It just sounds like you were a good person today, but you don't know what you did that was good. And so it's not that helpful a comment. So that's just one example of what sounds like a very simple, harmless habit, but it's hard to unlearn. I even find myself saying it sometimes because it's such an ingrained habit. It's a way of being nice. It's a way of simply recognizing somebody. But it took work for me to start learning to say, that was an extremely good question. And here's why it was a good question. Good job is just a reflex almost. And there are many habits like that about, for example, another habit would be calling on students who have their hands raised, and especially calling on students who you think have the right answer. If you do that all the time, you develop an expectation about who has right answers, like we talked about today, and you're also raising the expectation that you're only going to be asked to speak if your hand is raised. So if you don't want to speak, just keep your hand down. So that's not good. That's not a good habit. Oh. You want students to come to think that they can contribute, and you're going to be asked to contribute frequently, and that's not a bad thing. But teachers, I think we're worried sometimes as teachers that nobody will have anything to say. And so when people raise their hand, we're eager to call on those people. But it creates really bad patterns in our classrooms. So breaking habits is hard, but we know something about that. There's so many things we all do that are habits, like, eating too much. So they know things.
Start running.
Well, we know things about what helps people to learn to eat differently. There are whole systems of helping people unlearn that. So we should take it seriously. It doesn't work just to say, that's not a great thing to say, don't do that. It's habitual because teaching has to be filled with habits and routines. So the task is to see the problem of your habits and learn new habits.
Some of the solution, as we have talked before, is the collaborative thinking, because if you have a colleague who are follow you in your changing, it will be easier.
Yes.
I know if I have to go run, it's easy for me to have a company instead of just be run by my own. I noticed in the video that the teacher got time to have discussion with the child. If I look around in several lessons, it go very fast because the teacher wants to show a lot of things in form of kind of imitating. You have to do such and such and use it and be aware of, and then go to the chapter 25 or something like that. She got time to it. And only one question. That's not often I see it. To focus. Don't you think it?
Well,
how is that a common way of doing it in America?
I would say no, but one thing we've done to help teachers think about that more deeply is you take that video. This is something that people who watch this video could do. And instead of watching for acknowledging competence, watch to see how much mathematical content was being taught that day. And I think you'd be surprised that although it's just one task, it's a lot of different goals.
I know,
and I think that helps people realize that when we go so fast, children aren't necessarily learning that. For example, this teacher is dwelling on the word equal. Why? Because we've learned that teachers often don't say the word equal very often. They just say how many parts. Then you talk to kids who are like 12 years old, and they still don't realize the parts have to be equal because we don't spend the time to really notice it has to be equal. So this teacher is making a big point out of that idea. So analyzing in a lesson like that, what are all the different pieces of mathematics that are being taught and learned might help.
I think the time is running. We could have been going on for several hours, I think. So I would thank you very much for coming to Copenhagen and have this session with me. Thank you much.
Thank you very much for asking me. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Og tak til jer derude. Vi ses igen til næste webinar.